My name is Nicole Reno. I'm the Director of Science Operations for the Ocean Exploration Trust, and I'm here today to present to you the preliminary results of the workshop for telepresence-enabled exploration of the Eastern Pacific. I'm going to share with you my screen right now, which has a presentation to go through these results. But I'd also like to point out that at any point, please feel free to take a look at the workshop report to read more information about these results and to contribute your comments on them. Also, because this is a pre-recorded video, Katie and I are standing by to read your comments or questions that you may have from the chat function here, so feel free to ask questions and we will answer them as we can. During the workshop, we had two different breakout groups, one focused on disciplines and one focused on regions. The point of the discipline-based breakout groups were to come up with a list of questions based around geology, archaeology, biology, and chemical and physical oceanography for the Eastern Pacific. So each group was tasked with coming up with about 10 questions that they thought were the most important things that we can try to figure out about the Eastern Pacific Basin, and then to locate several areas within the region that they would go to address these questions. So what you're looking at here is a map of the white paper locations, and we really ask that people abandon their specific white papers and think about their discipline and the questions that are really important to their discipline at a much larger scale. The results of the archaeologist discussion were 5 different questions that centered around hubs of maritime activity, known naval battle locations, and known or suspected wrecks. So their questions are: what are the patterning of wrecks around key ports, and what can that tell us about Pacific economies and intercultural exchange through time? Also focusing on nearshore areas is looking at historic submerged settlements. Third question is one of developing techniques and processes to apply a detailed landscape view to underwater battlefields to reinterpret historical events using forensic evidence. A fourth question is identifying key sites in the Pacific that speak to the archaeology of discard and how this impacts the environment. And finally, can we find archaeological evidence of pre-European Asian contact at Eastern Pacific sites? These 5 questions that the archaeologists posed can be answered at the 9 locations that they've targeted. These locations include American Samoa, where there's a known clipper aircraft and the approaches to the major port of Pago Pago, the Battle of Midway in Hawaii, where there's a sunken battlefield in the USS Yorktown, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, where there are many wrecks, including submarines and scuttled ships. There's also an ordnance dump. And then areas off of the United States from the Olympic Peninsula and Washington down through the southern coast of California, where there are also known wrecks and submerged shorelines. Finally, the major ports of Lima, Peru, and Valparaiso, Chile, could provide information on wreck patterns around ports and archaeological discard. The biologists came up with 6 key questions, and these were meant to cover the broad diversity of habitats that are found in this Eastern Pacific Basin. They wanted to include both protected and non-protected areas, pristine and human-impacted environments. And the key points that their questions stress are understanding the connectivity of habitat, the adaptive capacity of an ecosystem, and management challenges, particularly with regard to global climate change. The questions are: what is the distribution of biodiversity both in the water column and on the seafloor? What is the biological baseline information that is required to help with environmental management? What are the large-scale biogeographic boundaries of the Eastern Pacific? What are the successional patterns of deep sea communities following perturbations? How are biological systems interconnected in the Eastern Pacific? And how can the natural environmental gradients in the Eastern Pacific help inform organism and ecosystem adaptations to global change? Based on these questions, the biologists came up with 17 locations and 2 transits that would help address these questions. Their areas focus along coastlines and tectonic margins from Alaska to Chile, around major island arcs, including Cook, Pitcairn, the Line Islands, Hawaii, and Clipperton, and then a few other areas, including the Chatham Bank off of New Zealand, Tonga, Fiji, and Kermadec region, and an area in the Central Pacific that is largely unexplored. They also plan 2 zigzag transits, recognizing that there would be long periods of time where we would be moving from one area of operation to another, and hoping to encourage us to actually stop along the way and do an ROV dive to characterize some of these areas that we wouldn't normally plan an expedition around because so little is known about it. So these zigzag transits are meant to cover different environments, including areas north and south of the equator, where we could add a lot of information about an area that has very little known about it. The geologists came up with 10 different questions focusing on different submarine hazards and environments and understanding the different geological provinces. Their questions are what the tectonic, volcanic, and sedimentary controls on fluid flow are, what are the characteristics of submarine geohazards and how do they relate to the tectonic setting, what factors control the behaviors of submarine volcanoes, what are the patterns of marine mineral resources and how do they relate to tectonic and oceanographic processes, what the magmatic, tectonic, and morphological characteristics at plate boundaries are, what are the possible impacts of submarine geological processes on the climate, a few questions surrounded understanding the large-scale geology of the basin, including identifying and characterizing geomorphic provinces, and a question of how we would create a geological map of the Eastern Pacific. Another question is, are there large undiscovered cosmic impact structures in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, and the difficulties surrounding identifying and characterizing these? And then finally, what are the relationships between ecosystems and geological processes in the Eastern Pacific? Based on these 10 questions, the geologists came up with 12 different locations. These focused on areas including trenches, like the Samoa and Tonga trench areas, island arcs including the Cook Islands, French Polynesia, Hawaii, Aleutians, and Galapagos, margins, including the active margins of Cascadia, California, Central America, and Chile, and ridges such as the East Pacific Rise. The physical oceanographers and chemical oceanographers came up with 14 different questions, and a couple of these involve the chemical components of the ocean, including where are oxygen minimum zones and what is the impact on local ecology, what are sources and sinks of nutrients and how is their distribution related to different geological and biological systems and features, why is there nutrient desertification happening, and then some questions examining large-scale physical oceanography phenomena, including looking at the currents, tides, and upwelling interactions with geological features. Being aware of the impacts of climate forcings, including El Nino and La Nina, on the environment that we're exploring, being mindful of where we are in that cycle and how that may impact what we're finding. Also, examining the nature of abyssal currents, looking at the distribution of cold seeps in the region and how far their impacts can be detected from the source. Looking at internal wave generation and determining where that energy goes. Measuring the impacts of ocean acidification throughout the water column and improving the ability to measure pH in situ. Examining or exploring why the seamounts in the Pacific, many of them have flat tops and steep vertical sides, but we don't find these in other ocean basins. Exploring the chemistry, including mineral and nutrient distribution around hydrothermal vents. And then looking at human impacts on the ocean, including the garbage patch, looking at the extent and volume of the patch, and also exploring the fate of the Fukushima radionuclides and how they can be used to determine deep sea circulation. So based on these 14 questions, the chemical and physical oceanographers identified 10 different locations. Many of these are going to look familiar because they overlap with the other discipline locations as well, including areas around islands, the Cook Islands, French Polynesia, Line Islands, Hawaii, the Aleutian Arc, the Kermadec, and Galapagos areas, and then also areas around the margins from the United States through Mexico, the Gulf of California, and central Chile. This map shows the overlap between the various discipline-based breakout groups. So you can see that there's quite a bit of overlap. And so the goal on the second day of the workshop for the second round of breakout groups, the region-based breakout groups, was to narrow down the region selected into more easily digestible, maybe cruise 2 to 3 week expedition locations. And so this slide shows how we came up with the regional boxes that were discussed on that second day. So we ended up with 3 boxes in the Northern Pacific, 2 boxes in the Eastern Pacific, and 2 boxes in the South Central Pacific to have these groups discuss cruise length areas to explore. I'm just going to briefly show you these maps and not talk at length about the questions that are being addressed in each of these. Those are available as summaries in the workshop report. But I did want to show you how these were narrowed down. So the Northern Pacific group came up with these several boxes shown here off the Aleutians, off of the west coast of the United States down through Mexico, and around Hawaii and the Hawaiian Island arc. The Eastern Pacific group came up with several boxes, including areas off of Mexico, Costa Rica, and Ecuador, including the Galapagos Islands, the Eastern Pacific Rise, and some areas off of South America. And then the South and Central Pacific group came up with some regions off of the Kermadec and some unexplored islands in the area. You can get more detailed information about each of these boxes and the questions that scientists hope to address in each of these areas from the workshop report, and also more information in the Google Earth KML that I've shared. Now I want to share with you the combined results. So this is our sort of final map of areas that are high priority for exploration in the next several years. There are 33 high priority areas, which include 25 target areas and 8 different transits between these boxes. So that's the conclusion of my presentation on this workshop results. And I'd like to thank you and invite you to join in our discussion.